Hello and welcome to today's edition of FNR Ask the Expert. Today we are talking about, appropriately, bats. We all have heard myths about bats over the years. We all know about, Dracula, and we think bats suck blood and they're blind and all these other things. Well, the two people that are here with us today are here to clear all of that up and tell us so much more that we never knew about bats. And they have done their work on the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment that we talked about the work on the HE for the last Thursdays of the month. And today we're talking about bats. So joining me today are Dr. Joy O'Keefe, who is, hold on a second, Assistant Professor of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences. She's also a Wildlife Extension Specialist at the University of Illinois. And she's also joined by PhD candidate Liz Beilke. And Liz has studied under her both at Indiana State and now also at the University of Illinois. So they are experts at all things bats, and they are going to share with us a little bit about that. So to start out, Dr. O'Keefe, tell us a little bit, why is it so important to study bats?
Thank you, Wendy. So great to be here. It is so important to study bats because they are, well, they're just really cool. First off, we love bats. That's why we devote pretty much all of our time to studying them and thinking about them. We know that bats are a lot like us. They're mammals, right? So they share some things in common with us. So bats can be an indicator of ecosystem health, and that can be important for helping to figure out where good habitat is. Also, bats in particular, as relates to the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment, bats rely on forests for a large part of the year. Even bats that spend a long time in caves will go to the forest for several months out of the year to roost in trees and to forage for insects. So all the bats that occur in Indiana are insectivorous. And so bats can be really important in providing ecosystem services to the forest, and then they're also dependent on the forest. And so the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment is a really great place for us to study bats because we can study their relationship with the forest and how they respond to management on the forest, which helps us to better manage bats. And several bats in Indiana are endangered or threatened at the federal level. And so we get information from this experiment that can then be translated to management practices across those species ranges. So really important to study bats for all of those reasons. And we've been doing this work on the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment since 2006. Some of my predecessors at Indiana State University started the project. I took it over in 2012, and then this year we've moved to the University of Illinois. So we're really proud to partner with the HE and with Purdue University and Indiana DNR Division of Forestry to ask these questions about bats over the course of this 100-year experiment. This has been a really big effort that has involved a lot of people and a lot of bats. So we like to acknowledge all of the graduate students listed here who have worked on the project, as well as Bryn Walters, who was assistant director to the Bat Center at ISU for many years and participated in this project all along, as well as many technicians, students, and volunteers. And then, of course, we always like to thank the bats, too, for cooperating with us so that we can ask questions about them. So Liz Beilke is not listed here, but she's a co-author on this presentation. She's a PhD student and a candidate for her PhD at Indiana State University. So I'm going to let her tell you a little bit about why we study bats first.
All right, thanks, Joy. So there are a lot of different reasons that we study bats, but I really just want to hone in on a few reasons that we study bats in this landscape. And the first is that they're ecologically important. So these are the predominant predator of night-flying insects. Previous work has shown that the average colony of big brown bats can consume over 1.3 million insects in a year. So they're voracious predators, and that's just a single colony of 150 big brown bats. And as we'll talk about later in the presentation, that type of depredation can have a really huge impact on the ecosystem that these bats are a part of. But on top of that, these bats are imperiled. So like many species, bats have been and continue to be negatively impacted by a variety of things like habitat loss or invasive species. In particular, an invasive fungal pathogen that causes white nose syndrome in bats and has led to some pretty severe population declines. So even in this landscape, there are many bat species that were once relatively common that we really don't experience anymore. And Joy will talk about that more in a moment. So really because these species are imperiled, it's important to be able to define critical habitat for these species and then manage for them accordingly. But sadly, many of these bats are understudied, and even for several species, we even lack a basic understanding of how they use the landscape, which can be problematic when you're trying to manage for them. And part of the reason that they're understudied is that they're really difficult to study. You know, we are diurnal, we are visually oriented, so a long time we really just didn't have the appropriate tools to study bats. But since then, we have developed several techniques for studying bats. One of the major ways that we capture bats is through the use of a technique called mist netting, and birders do this too. This is essentially deploying a very fine mesh net across flyways. These might be forest corridors or roads or sources of water. And if we're lucky, a unsuspecting bat will crash into one of these nets. It'll get tangled up, and then we come in, we don our protective gloves, we extract the bat, and now we have a bat in hand. We can take several morphological measurements, and if it's an individual that we're interested in studying further, we can use surgical glue to apply a radio transmitter just to the area between the shoulder blades. And this allows us to study the bat using a technique called radio telemetry. So using a receiver and an antenna, we can hone in on the location of the bat, which enables us to locate where they're roosting during the day and even track them as they're foraging on the landscape at night. And another technique that we use to study bats is a passive technique called acoustic monitoring. So we deploy an acoustic detector out on the landscape. We can leave it there for a few days, and this detector will passively record bat echolocation calls as bats are flying through the area. We can return to the site a few days later, collect the device, and now we have all kinds of information on the activity levels at that site and the type of bats that were in that area. So this is really just a brief overview. I'm happy to field more questions if you're interested in other techniques or have particular questions about the methods we employ. But in the meantime, I'd like to hand it back over to Joy to talk about some of the research that we actually do on this landscape.
Thank you, Liz. So when we do acoustic monitoring, we detect a lot of bats, sometimes bat species that we may not have captured, but with a lot of dedicated effort, we can actually document the full assemblage of bats on the landscape. And we've done that over the years. We've captured a variety of different species. Here you can see the eastern red bat and the big brown bat, which are two of our more common bats in Indiana and also on this landscape. And then here's Liz and doctoral student, well, now he's a doctor, Tim Dival, working up one of the bats and checking out its wings. So over the years, we have captured a variety of species. They're listed down here in this graph on the right side. The most common species that we capture are the big brown bat, the eastern red bat, the Indiana bat, and the northern long-eared bat. And those last two are closely related species or more closely related species. They're in the same genus, which is Myotis, or the mouse-eared bats. And you can see we've been netting bats out on the He landscape since 2006. And when we first started working out there, which was prior to any treatment in the forest, the first couple years we're just getting a baseline idea of who was there. And some net sites were established that were close to all of the He units, so we could basically get the full suite of bats out there. And what we saw at the time is that the bat community was primarily big brown bats, shown in the blue color, eastern red bats in the orange color, and then northern long-eared bats in the green color. But occasionally other species were captured, such as hoary bats, which are this is the largest bat in Indiana, foliage-dwelling bat that migrates long distances and is thought not really to be present very often in Indiana during the summer. We also would capture little brown bats, which are really a water-adapted bat, also in the genus Myotis, that likes to forage over streams and lakes, and so wouldn't really be expected in the interior forest of the He, but we would occasionally capture them. And then we would also sometimes catch tricolored bats. In my experience, tricolored bats may be very common on the landscape, but can be quite difficult to capture. They're the smallest bat that occurs on the He landscape. The adults will be a maximum of about 6 grams, so that's 6 paper clips. A very small bat, a very maneuverable bat, and sometimes you really have to trick them in order to catch them in your nets. You have to do some kind of funky things to them. And then also Indiana bats, which is our federally endangered myotis that's pictured up here at the top. Well, over the years, the bats on the He landscape have changed. Bat assemblage has changed. We saw starting in about 2011 that we started to see a sort of shift. We weren't catching Indiana bats there for a little while, and that may have been as a result of where we were netting for bats. But in 2012, we started netting over small forest ponds, which we had not done before. And as I mentioned, water is relatively rare in that landscape. And so once we started netting over those small forest ponds, we started catching bats that were coming to water. But at the same time, we were not picking up little brown bats. And that is a bat that we would expect to come to water. So why might we have lost them? Well, in 2011, that was the first year that we detected white nose syndrome, which is a disease that is affecting cave hibernating bats in Indiana and throughout North America. It's in most of North America, just not the desert Southwest quite yet, but it will probably get there. This disease is caused by a fungus that is thought to be an invasive species that was brought over from Europe or Asia. It first appeared in a cavern in New York State in the winter of 2006. 2007, 2008, that winter, they started to notice that bats in caves in New York in that region had this white fungus growing on their nose, and they called this, issue, they didn't know what it was, they called it white nose syndrome. Well, very soon after that, we started to see die-offs in bats in that region, and then the disease started to spread down the Appalachian mountain chain, and then it started to move west into the Midwest, and we first detected it here in Indiana in 2011. Well, the bats that are affected are bats that roost in large clusters in caves. And Indiana bats, northern long-eared bats, and little brown bats fit the bill. Other species that occur at the He that are affected include big brown bats and tricolored bats, but they have a different roosting ecology during the winter. And of those species, the big brown bats are the least affected. Tricolored bats like to roost in really moist places in caves during the winter, and so they actually are pretty hard hit by white nose syndrome because this fungus thrives in cold, moist conditions. But we've seen a pretty large die-off in our little brown bat population in the Midwest, and you see that reflected here in our captures, that they just disappeared, and we haven't caught one on the He in several years. Indiana bats are doing okay in Indiana. So whereas in some parts of their range, the species has declined by over 90% as a result of white nose syndrome, here in Indiana, we've seen about a 30% decline in their wintering population, and we still catch them regularly on the He. As of 2019, they were still one of our semi-dominant species. We only caught 3 species in 2019. Northern long-eared bats started to peak after white nose syndrome hit in Indiana. We don't really understand why that happened, but that has happened in other places across their range. And so you see in particular in 2014, a really large green bar. Northern long-eared bats were one of our more common captures. But then they steadily declined. And as of 2019, we didn't catch any northern long-eared bats out on the He. And so the bat assemblage has actually shifted over time. And some of those oddballs like silver-haired bats or hoary bats will still pop up occasionally in the coming years, but we may have lost entirely our northern long-eared bats and our little brown bats. And that could have ramifications for what happens in the forest as a result of the decline in these species, as we'll talk about their ecosystem services in just a little bit. So now I want to talk in particular about Indiana bats, which have been really a focal species for us over the past 8 years as we've been working on the He, trying to understand how this federally endangered species uses the forest and how it responds to forest management. So Indiana bats during the summer, they migrate to the areas where they're going to set up their summer maternity roosts in April. So we see them arriving in early to mid-April and forming colonies by the end of April. And the colony will be composed of a bunch of female Indiana bats and ultimately their pups. When they arrive on the summer landscape, they're already pregnant. It takes about 60 days for these bats to give birth to a single pup. That pup then stays with mom for another 4 weeks or so, developing its ability to fly and gaining enough strength. And then the pup becomes independent. And while it may still want to roost with mom, shoves it off. And we'll see those guys go off and roost by themselves. So during the summer, we have this aggregation of females, then females and their pups. And then the colony starts to break up as the females are shooing the young out of the roost, and everybody's got a different strategy as they prepare for fall when they're going to migrate back to their hibernation sites. They're always using trees. If that's, on a natural landscape, this is what Indiana bats are going to do. And they're not looking for a particular species of tree. They're looking for a tree with the right kind of structure. So an ideal condition for a female Indiana bat who is pregnant and lactating once she has given birth is a tree that gets a lot of solar exposure and that's pretty warm during the day. Bats are heterotherms, which means that while they can regulate their own body temperature, sometimes they act like an ectotherm. Sometimes they act like a snake or a reptile, in that they will just use the surrounding environment to warm up or to cool down. And by doing so, that allows them to save energy. So when a bat returns to its roost in the morning, the roost is relatively cold, this tree, usually a big dead tree. But as the sun hits the roost during the day, it warms up, and then the bat's body temperature warms up too. And so the female bats don't actually have to use energy to get warm enough to go out and forage at night. They just rely on the sun. And so to do that, they need to roost in these large solar exposed roosts. And then they will also roost in rather large groups, which provides them with some warmth as well because they get body heat from the other individuals in the roost. So we've been using radio telemetry, which Liz mentioned as a technique, to track Indiana bats to find out what kinds of trees and what places on the landscape are appropriate for them to roost during the summer. Where are they choosing to spend their time? And so I want to share with you some results from my student Scott Bergeson's PhD work on the HE project. Scott tracked Indiana bats on the HE from 2012 to 2015. And he measured a lot of characteristics about the trees that they used, and then ran some models to compare trees used by Indiana bats to trees that were randomly available on the landscape. And by and large, he found that females were roosting in dead trees or snags. 72% of the roosts that we found were in snags, and the bats were roosting under the exfoliating bark. And I won't talk about the results from studies on northern long-eared bats on the HE, except to say that oftentimes when northern long-eared bats are tracked, they're roosting in a cavity. So this is another Myotis species that has a slightly different strategy in terms of the types of trees that they will use. Most of the roosts that Indiana bats were using were maples and elms, but they used a variety of species. And again, they're looking for structure. They're not looking necessarily for a particular tree species. When we modeled to figure out what roost scale characters were important, kind of the tree or the surrounding landscape really close by, what we found is that tree height and canopy closure were important model parameters. So if you look at the graphs on the left side of the screen, female roosts used by females are the lighter gray bar, and then the darker gray bar is available trees. And you can see that roosts used by females tended to be taller than available trees on the landscape. But roosts used by females tended to have less canopy closure above. So they were taller trees that were getting more solar exposure than the available trees. And this is, of course, necessary if the females are going to get enough sun to warm up passively and save energy during the summer. Scott also looked at a larger scale at where the bats were roosting. And we found that when we looked around this very heterogeneous landscape, there's lots of different openings on the HE. There are clear cuts, there's shelterwood cuts, there's right-of-way corridors, and then there's the forest matrix. And the forest matrix isn't completely unharvested. There's been single tree selection inside the forest matrix, so individual trees have been removed. But when you look through the forest, all you see is, mature trees. And so those are very different structurally for the bats. Well, the females, when we compare to males and also to random points, you can see a big difference. So the proportion of female roosts that were in clearings was much higher. That's the clear white on the bar on the left. And females roosted in or within 10 meters of harvest openings, such as small patch cuts or clear cuts or right-of-way corridors, more often than expected based on the availability on the landscape. And we found in particular that they used these 0 to 10-year-old patch cuts. They also used a power line right-of-way where there were a few bat boxes, and we occasionally found bats roosting in bat boxes. And then we found them in 2 first-stage shelterwood cuts. Males, on the other hand, had a different strategy. They used harvested areas as expected based on availability. And this makes sense because males take a different tactic during the summer. They actually try to conserve energy for most of the summer by remaining largely ectothermic. So they want to stay in these cool roosts and not burn up any energy getting hot when they don't need to get hot. And so they just will choose roosts that are more often in the forest, and they're also more often roosting alone as opposed to with a large group. And so they don't get benefits from that social thermoregulation that goes on in the maternity roosts. That being said, males occasionally break the rules and go and roost with the females, and I'm sure they get yelled at by the female bats, but they do that sometimes. So that's some results on what Indiana bats do with regards to roosting. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Liz and let her tell you about eastern redbats.
Yes, so the eastern redbat employs a very different strategy, ecological strategy than the myotis on this landscape. The redbats are the live fast, die young bat on this landscape in that they don't live as long, but they're also producing more pups in a year. So they have up to 4 pups, whereas the myotis tend to have just a single pup. They're also, eastern redbats are solitary roosters. They're not roosting in these large colonies. And they also use live trees. Will you transition to the next slide for me? Thank you. So in this picture, this is a photograph of an eastern redbat roost. This is a large tulip poplar out on the landscape. And I haven't analyzed my data, but I can certainly share with you some of the trends that I've observed. In general, on this landscape, eastern redbats are overwhelmingly using tall mid-slope trees, particularly oaks, hickories, and tulip poplars, mostly oaks, to a lesser extent hickories and tulip poplars. And like many other bat species, they are switching between roosts every few days. So in this photograph, this bat used the pictured tulip poplar for a few days and then actually transitioned to the tree you can see in the very upper left corner of the photograph. And that's what we see in a lot of these bats. They're just circulating through 3 or 4 trees in a very small area. Their home ranges also incorporate several sources of water, and they're foraging in the immediate vicinity of their roosts, which is another interesting contrast because the myotis, we frequently observe the myotis commuting to forage. So they're roosting in one spot, foraging in a separate spot, but the eastern redbats are just roosting where they forage and foraging where they roost. And you can see some of this on this next slide. So in the map here, the orange splotch in the middle of the screen is an eastern redbat home range, and you can see that it incorporates multiple sources of water, and it's roosting basically smack dab in the middle of its home range. Some other interesting things we've observed are that the foraging ranges for multiple individuals frequently overlap. And the next bullet point, the foraging ranges are much, much smaller than the other species on this landscape. So on average, their foraging ranges are about 87 hectares, which is a bit difficult to comprehend, but if you look at the diameter of that foraging range on the map, it's about a 1/2 kilometer or a 1/3 mile. So you could easily traverse that. And The myotis in this landscape, their home ranges tend to be 3-4 times bigger than that. So that's an interesting finding. And I think now I can turn it back to you, Joy, to talk about some of the dietary studies that we did.
Sure. I want to point out that it's really ironic to us that red bats don't fly very far, because this is a bigger bat than our myotis bats and has much longer wings and is adapted for fast and long distance flight. But in reality, what they do is they tend to sit close to their roosts, and that might speak to the quality of the foraging habitat available around their roost, that they don't need to fly longer distances. On the other hand, the myotis, as Liz mentioned, do tend to fly farther. Northern long-eared bats actually stick relatively close, but the Indiana bats fly far. And it may be because they're trying to distance from each other, because they have similar echolocation calls that overlap, and so it might be easier to forage somewhere where there's not another bat that sounds just like you. We're not really sure why, but I want to talk a little bit about work done by Timothy Diebold.
Before you get started on that, Dr. O'Keefe, I just want to remind people, if they have questions, I know we've covered a lot of material, so if they have questions, go ahead and put those on Facebook so you guys can answer those when we finish the presentation here. And now back to you to talk more about diets.
No problem. We'll answer them all as we go here. So we're covering a lot of ground, like you said. So I want to talk about these two species a little bit more. Tim Diebold did his PhD work out on the HE project from 2014 to 2017. And he specifically focused in on Indiana bats, which is on the left side of the screen, and northern long-eared bats on the right side of the screen. As I mentioned, these are both myotis or mouse-eared bats. They have similar ear structure, but the northern long-eared bat has slightly longer ears. And that doesn't seem like a huge difference, but it actually translates to a pretty strong dietary preference for moths. It's thought that bats with longer ears are better able to hear moths, which can be very quiet. And bats with longer ears also tend to be gleaners. So what I mean by a gleaner is a bat that will go to a piece of vegetation and actually pluck an insect right off of a leaf. Indiana bats are aerial hawkers, so they are flying around, and when they encounter an insect in the air, they will grab it out of the air. And they can do that with their mouth, or they can do that with their tail. So a bat may just run into an insect. It drops into its tail, and then the bat reaches down with its mouth and scoops the insect out of its tail and eats it in flight. So they have very different strategies in the micro space where they are actually foraging, and that can translate to different strategies in terms of where they want to forage on the landscape. So Tim tracked these bats at night for 4 years to get an idea of how big their foraging home ranges are and where they foraged. And that paper is in development right now. He defended his dissertation last year and then promptly started up a job. So hopefully we'll get these out and everybody can read about what these bats do. But the other thing that Tim did is he looked at their diets. And to do that, he actually took guano pellets from bats that were captured at the table. While we were working up the bat, we would take the little pieces of guano either out of the bags, or sometimes they're stuck to the bat's fur, or sometimes the bat poops them out right while you're holding the bat in your hand. And then you could put those in with some silica beads, take them back to the lab, extract the DNA from the guano, and then sequence it. Now, previously, the way that we figured out what bats ate before sequencing methods got really good is you would actually have to tease apart that piece of guano under a microscope and look for insect parts. And by doing that, we did learn that moths, beetles, and flies, yes, are the main components of a bat's diet. But we couldn't get much more specific than that in a lot of cases, because you don't get a lot of material to work with. There might be a leg or a piece of a wing or a piece of the thorax, but there's not the entire insect. But as we know, DNA encodes individual identities for species, and if we can just get the DNA, we can usually figure out what bats are eating. So we sequenced specifically the CO1 gene, which differs across different insect species, and then we blasted our results against the Barcode of Life database in Canada, which is where everybody deposits their sequences as they are sequencing insects in their laboratories, so insect specialists. And actually, as an example of this, we found that spiders in an initial analysis were pretty important in the diet of the northern long-eared bat. So Tim worked with a spider expert in Indianapolis who had 100 different species of spiders that were not in the Barcode of Life database, but did occur in Indiana. We added the sequences for all of those to the Barcode of Life database so that then we could compare the bats' diets to those as well as to the other insects. And so what did we find when we looked at these bats' diets? Well, incredibly, they're really diverse. Okay, so Indiana bats on the left side of the table, northern long-eared bats on the right side of the table. The number of bats we sampled, 78 and 88. For Indiana bats, we found that they ate, as a whole, all 78 bats, 547 different kinds of prey. Northern long-eared bats ate 435 different kinds of prey. So actually a slightly less diverse diet considering that we had more bats. There was a lot of overlap, okay? So the two species had about 82% overlap in their diet in this forested landscape. So collectively, they ate just over 700 different species of insects. What were they eating? Well, the top 5 species are actually pictured here. So the first is the crane fly in the top left, which is like a larger version of a mosquito. They're very closely related to mosquitoes. They're just a big bumbling insect that would be easy for a bat to catch in flight. Second on the list, yay, is mosquitoes. Okay, so it turns out that these bats do consume a lot of mosquitoes, just a handful of mosquito species, but they are eating mosquitoes. And that makes sense for these small bats because mosquitoes are relatively small. And for a smaller bat, their echolocation calls allow them to detect those smaller insect prey. Third on the list, bottom left, is the midge fly. So a variety of species of midge flies, which are a true fly. So flies are a very important part of the diets of these two species. And then third on the list is Microlepidoptera. So micro means small, Lepidoptera is the butterflies and the moths. Of course, bats aren't eating butterflies because those are active during the day, but they very much are eating moths, and they're eating a lot of really important moths that are really tiny. We actually know very little about Microlepidoptera because they're difficult to capture and identify. If you do capture them, they tend to fall apart in the sample. So there's not a lot known about them, but it turns out they're really important in these bats' diets. And then fifth on the list is leafhoppers, which is a type of true bug that is actually an important predator of plants. They suck juices out of plants. So a lot of the insects that these bats are eating are economically and ecologically important bats in the forest. So this is just a short list of some of the 700 and so species that these two bats ate. And you can see some examples of moths and bugs that are important pests for some of our forest plants. And of course, the names of the plants are there in the names of the bugs. So it gives you an idea of what kind of impacts these bats are going to have. And so this is really exciting. And I'll do a spoiler for Liz. She's also looking at the diets of eastern red bats. So we'll be able to compare that to Indiana bats and northern long-eared bats. But Liz is going to tell you how she took this information and went just a little bit further, or a lot further, in terms of estimating bats' impacts to the forest.
Yeah, so when we realized that bats were eating a ton of these defoliating insects, we naturally started to wonder whether or not they were consuming enough of these insects that it would have a meaningful impact on the forest itself. So this is a very typical trophic cascade, the idea being that insects are eating the plants and the bats are eating the insects. So the bats should have a positive indirect impact on the bottom of the chain, the plants. So we decided to test this using an experimental setup in transition slides. So we deployed these huge exclosures on the landscape. They're essentially giant nets that prevent bats from accessing portions of the forest understory. And what we found was that when you exclude bats from forest understory, there's on average 6 times more insect defoliation in those plots. So if you look at the graph on the left, you have percent defoliation on the y-axis, and then you can see the treatment versus the control on the x-axis. The treatment plots are the ones where bats were prevented from accessing, and the control plots are the ones, they're essentially netless plots that bats were permitted to forage within. So this is a huge effect size, much bigger than I ever anticipated. But we also found that different trees within those plots responded differently to the presence of bats. So oaks and hickories, there was a huge benefit to oaks and hickories to have bats foraging in their immediate vicinity. And we didn't see that effect for maple trees. And on some level, this makes sense because a lot of the defoliation that we observed in the oaks and hickories was chewing damage that we typically associate with beetles and moths, and as we just found out, those are key prey items for the bats in this landscape. However, the defoliation that we observed on the maples was often a type of galling that's caused by a mite, and a mite isn't a typical prey item of a bat. So this does make sense, but this is kind of an exciting finding for a couple different reasons. It suggests that bats are hugely beneficial to forests, and in particular oak hickory forests, because of their consumption of these defoliating insects. But on the flip side, it also reinforces this idea that oak hickory forests are really beneficial to wildlife, in that they're supporting bats by providing them with a whole suite of bat-friendly prey items. And that is what I have.
All right, thanks, Liz. So just a few conclusions from our work, and then we'll take your questions via Wendy. So first off, the forest bat assemblage here on the He is not static. It may have been at one time, but with human land use change, and then also other factors like disease, we're seeing that bat populations are changing worldwide, and that even common species like the northern long-eared bat can just wink out and disappear on a landscape like this, which is just shocking. You know, this is a bat that was one of our more common captures when we started the project, and now it's gone. We also do see that endangered bats and many other species can subsist in forests like the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment, where we have low intensity timber management. So there was management on the landscape before the He experiment started in the Yellowwood and Morgan Monroe State Forests. And then there's been continued management since 2008. And we continue to see Indiana bats persisting in this landscape, and in fact, even using some of the harvested areas. But other factors can be an overriding factor on that. So like the northern long-eared bat, we don't really get to see how it's responding to the forest treatment because it has disappeared because of white nose syndrome. Now, we also learned through this work that bats eat a wide variety of insect species, and we suspect that they could play a significant role in pest control. We don't currently have a way to quantify the number of insects that they're eating. When you sequence DNA, you have to amplify it, and some species are going to amplify, or some insects parts are going to amplify better than others. And so we don't really get a good like relative abundance. Molecular biologists are working on those techniques, and maybe we'll be able to go back and re-examine our data or run the DNA again through the sequencer to see if we can quantify what the bats are eating. But the number of times that certain species pop up does give us an indication, and that's where I got that list of the top 5 insect prey that are consumed by these 2 species. But still, we suspected that pest control could impact the forest, and Liz has demonstrated that through 3 years of exclosure experiments where she only excluded bats. She wake up at dawn or before dawn and go out and open those exclosures up so the birds could have access, and then close them again at night, and do that every night for a few months. And after doing that, we saw that bats significantly impact sapling growth and the fates probably of the saplings. So lots of really cool information has come out of our work on the He thus far. And I want to emphasize that it's critical that we continue to study forest bats. They're always showing us something new, And by studying the entire assemblage, we actually get a better idea of how these species interact with each other and with the forest, and can better understand how to manage forests for bats and how to protect the bats within those forests, and then to understand how bats are benefiting the forests and us by existing in that landscape with us. So with that, I guess I'll turn it back over to Wendy and let her ask us questions.
Perfect. Thank you. You guys put a ton of information out there, so I hope people can go back and we'll watch this in archive and re-look at some of the data, because it's incredible. You caught me, 1.3 million insects. For those of us that don't like bugs, that sounds fantastic. So I wanted to throw a question to Liz. We had a question about the exclosures, and you alluded to this a little bit, Dr. O'Keefe, but that those are opened and closed each night. But can you describe how these exclosures were constructed, and just a little bit about them? We had a question from Lisa.
Yeah, actually, Joy, if you could share your screen again. I did include one picture of these exclosures because I thought that this question might come up, and I think it will help to have a visual aid. So these exclosures were, yeah, if you flip forward, yep. So this is a photograph of us actually putting one of these up. These exclosures are 7 meters by 7 meters by 7 meters. It's essentially a soccer mesh netting that is strung up between steel top fence, and there's actually a steel line that runs between the tops of these poles to help support the net. And it's on a pulley system so that we can close at night so bats can't get into the plots, and open them in the morning so that birds can access those plots. It was really important to us that we be able to parse the effect that birds might be having versus bats on these forest saplings. And I think, does that?
I think that'll cover it. So the next question, sorry, my dog really likes wildlife as well. But question coming in is, how do bats respond to prescribed fire and timber harvesting and some of the other things that happen on the He?
Sure. So thanks for that question, Wendy. So what we found with regards to how bats are responding to timber harvest is we're looking at the responses the next season, not exactly when the timber harvesting is happening. But over the kind of long term, we're seeing that bats are investigating those harvest areas, and that they are roosting in those harvest areas. So Catherine Caldwell, who was a master's student at Ball State University, published a study where she did the acoustics. Liz showed a picture of her crazy acoustic setup. The microphones were 20 or more feet in the air, hoisted up, and she would put them out in patch cuts, shelterwood cuts, in the interior forest. And she found that a variety of bat species were actually responding positively to those cut areas. We haven't specifically looked at prescribed fire on the He, but I can tell you that the responses to prescribed fire are going to be different depending on the bat species. So northern long-eared bats and Indiana bats typically roost in dead trees. And that means that fire could be having an indirect effect by either taking or creating the kinds of trees that those bats choose to roost in. And so we definitely need to do more work on that to understand how fire affects what I call snag availability. But fire does open up the forest understory and create new growth, which could provide new foraging conditions that are optimal for northern long-eared bats or for Indiana bats, which like to forage in the forest interior. My colleague Luke Dodd has done some work on that at Mammoth Cave National Park and found that bats respond positively to fire. On the flip side, a species like the eastern red bat that roosts in foliage, if it's in the foliage during a fire, that bat could be consumed, especially if it's in torpor. So we like to recommend that fires be lit on warm days or warmer parts of the day, so bats are more likely to be at an active body temperature where they can respond to fire. There's been some work in Missouri looking at how red bats respond to the sound and the smell of fire as the smoke approaches, and they will detect that and start to warm up, but they need time to warm up. So it would be better if they were anticipating the fire at the same time that they were already at a relatively warm temperature so they could react to the fire. But roosting in foliage, they're really out there in the open, and they're probably not going to be swept away in a fire during the growing season. Now, interestingly, and we haven't done any winter work on the He, but eastern redbats will roost on the ground during the winter, and we do suspect that there are some eastern redbats in this landscape in the winter. They'll actually take an oak leaf and roll up in it and hang out on the forest floor. And oftentimes fires are conducted during the dormant season. So that's another area for research that we could explore.
So they like blankets, leaves as blankets.
Yes, absolutely. Well, redbats actually have a really fuzzy tail. Laziurus, which is their genus, means hairy tail. And their tail is completely covered in fur, which is like stark contrast to the Myotis bats. And so they will wrap that little tail around them and roll up. And they even do that when they're roosting in the leaves during the summer. Liz has some really cool pictures of red bats in the leaves where she's tracked the bat to the tree, and the bat is rolled up in a little ball in the tree.
Good to know. And so you answered Meredith's question. Thanks for doing that about bats being in the forest year round. We know they are, but you guys aren't. Always, you have to do other work. But let's talk a little bit about some general bat questions. I know we've talked a lot about bats on the Ask the Expert series in the past, and whether they're blind and things like that. But we talked about the bats eating insects, but what's eating the bats, or that type of thing? And how long do they live? We know they're pretty small creatures. Do they have a long lifespan that we can track them over, especially on a project like the He?
I'm going to let Liz take these questions. I know she'll have some good answers.
Yeah, so we know that bats are not blind, as you saw in a lot of the photos. They do have eyes, and it's been said that their eyesight is pretty comparable to human eyesight. And I think there's increasing evidence that that bats are actually using their eyesight while they're flying around on the landscape to the extent that they can, although we know that their primary modality is, or sensory modality is, through echolocation. They are very long-lived species, although there's definitely variation between different species. We know from captive scenarios that bats can live up to 30 years, possibly even longer. But then again, I talked earlier about how red bats are much shorter lived. And, you know, I'm not quite sure what the cap on that is, but based on recaptures at the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment, we know that the bats on that landscape are living to at least 6 years old. We caught a bat that we affectionately named Big Red for 6 years in a row, but we haven't seen her lately. And then what was the last question?
What eats the bats?
Oh yeah,
they have predators.
Yeah, so owls definitely, and blue jays are also a predator of bats, and snakes. And then of course, if you're in more urban landscapes, we know that cats can be a real problem for bats as well.
And you led right into the next set of questions that we have. We've got a question about tree species that are particularly beneficial to the bats, both on the He and then maybe in the urban landscape.
Sure. So it's interesting because the He is actually targeting oak and hickory management, right? We want to promote oaks and hickories on this landscape where they have become more scarce than they used to be. And that's great because oaks and hickories are a great species for wildlife as mass-producing trees. Well, it turns out they're good for bats too. When we track bats to roost trees, whether it's a bat that roosts under the sloughing bark of a dead tree or it's a bat that roosts in the foliage, they like oaks and hickories. They are some of the dominant species that they will use. And I think that may relate to the fact that they have big leaves and they can be really big trees. And then when they die, that's going to create a large canopy gap, and that's going to be a great tree for them to roost in under the bark. So I've tracked a lot of bats to trees, and oaks and hickories are really popular roosts. Another thing about oaks and hickories, there was another study on the He that looked at the fates of acorns, and they found that these weevils, these little beetles, would get into the acorns and consume them. And lo and behold, bats eat those little weevils. So the trees are also producing food for bats in kind of an indirect way, not just the leaves being food for insects, but also even the acorns. So we definitely like to track bats out on the landscape and see what they're doing, but it's no surprise when they roost in an oak or a hickory. But other trees that are important include ash and elm, especially in the Midwest. Elm is a big tree that's used along riparian strips, and so are cottonwood trees. So trees that can be really big, really fast. A cottonwood is actually an early successional tree that can get really large in just 70 or 100 years. And then if it dies, we had some cottonwood trees that were killed by beavers up near Indianapolis. And once the beavers killed them, the bark started to slough off the trees, and then you had hundreds of bats under the bark of those trees. So any tree that gets big fast could also be an important tree for bats. And then trees that are susceptible to disturbance can also be important. And so that I mentioned ash. A lot of folks know that the emerald ash borer has made its way through Indiana, killing off ash trees around the landscape. And as those trees die, you get these kind of patches of dead trees. And that can be a great place for a bat to roost because they can switch from one tree to another and get into different roosting conditions. So ash trees or other trees that are susceptible to disturbance can be important roosts for bats.
And speaking of roosting, we have a question from Sarah. It's a great question. Do bats always rest upside down, or is that just a myth we see on TV and on the movies?
Take it away, Liz.
Yeah, they do always rest upside down, and it's my understanding that this is an adaptation to essentially go from a resting position to a flying position. I think it's useful to draw a comparison to birds. Birds also fly, but they do not rest upside down. And this is because they are proportionally a lot lighter. They have hollow bones. Bats are, compared to birds at least, heavy. And so not all of them really have the capacity to go from an upright position to flying. So instead, they roost upside down so that they can just drop and gain some lift via gravity.
Yeah, that's actually, we have a problem during the summer when we catch a pregnant bat. You need someone tall to let her go because she is carrying about 25% of her body weight in the pup or pups that are in her belly. And she's very heavy and she needs more space to fly. So when we let those bats go, I'm not very good at it because I'm only 5'4". So I have to give it to someone who's taller to let that bat go, or put her on a tree and she'll climb right up. And then she's got enough height to actually drop and catch air.
So to wrap it up, a few things. I know we talked about your research on the he, which is fantastic, but people want to know about bats near them. What can they do in their urban landscapes, in their suburban homes, to help bats and to maybe attract them to their woodlands or other areas like that away from the he?
So that's a great question. We definitely have a lot more urban spaces nowadays. And if we want to have healthy bat populations, we're going to have to think across a larger scale and not just at the scale of the forest. I'd say anything you can do to promote trees and more trees on the landscape is good. Indiana is only about 20% forest, and I've been told many times by many people that we're not converting agricultural fields to forests, but if we had more trees, we would, have strong bat populations in areas where we don't have them now because they need trees. As we've demonstrated, that's very important. How can you support trees otherwise? Well, you can keep trees up in your yard. If you don't have access to trees, you could try to promote trees somewhere else, like in a park or a schoolyard or something like that. We also can promote clean water sources. So many of the bats that occur in Indiana do rely on insects that emerge from water, mayflies and caddisflies, and those insects are going to be dependent on clean water sources. And so if we can make sure that we have less point and non-point source pollution into our streams, then we can improve bat habitat in that regard. At the kind of smaller scale, in your own backyard, what can you do? Well, I would say plant plants, native plants that are good for insects, and then you're basically providing food for bats. But you can't just do that in your backyard. You're going to have to convince all your neighbors to do it too, because a bat needs a larger area to forage, and they're not just going to hop over the interstate and go through an desert of no vegetation to get to your house. So, and a lot of people will put up bat boxes, and we have actually done a tremendous amount of research into bat boxes in our lab, and we are learning a lot about bat boxes. But I'll tell you a few things I know about bat boxes in your backyard. If you go to a big box store and you buy a bat box, it's probably not what you need to buy. It's probably too small, won't hold very many bats, and it might not be suitable for a large colony of bats like we see on natural landscapes. That doesn't mean bats won't use it, but you might not support very many bats. But the other thing to consider is if you put up a bat box in your backyard, you may be actually either wasting your time because bats aren't going to come there because there's not enough other habitat, or you may be drawing bats into kind of a bad situation if they have to cross busy roads, or if they're more susceptible to predation because there's more lights in your areas and the hawks and the owls can see them better. That could create a risk factor for bats. There's also a concern we have about parasites in bat boxes. We see a large accumulation of parasites in boxes, and we don't know if that actually happens in trees as well. So that's something we need to study more. So in general, I would say promote natural habitats and protect trees, and you're doing a great job for protecting bats if you can do all that. And Liz, if I've left anything out, you want to add anything, go right ahead.
I know, I feel like that was pretty good.
And then one final question. What should you guys talked about when you actually are taking the bats out of the nets, you're using protective gloves and other protective gear. What should someone do if they do find a bat on their property, whether on the ground or in that it God forbid, flies inside their house? What should they do? Should they be calling someone, or are there things that they should be doing to protect themselves and the bats?
Liz, you want to tackle that?
Well, I don't want to get myself into any trouble, so feel free to interrupt me. I think if it's outside, it's probably just best to leave it alone. We know that they can vector diseases. Rabies occurs in bats. It's not a very large proportion of the population that carries it, but it is a potential risk factor. And even if they're not sick, they can still bite you and injure you, and you don't want that. If it's in your house, I have definitely heard of people using butterfly nets to grab them, or grabbing them through thick gloves and a towel, things like that. There are definitely people you can contact to remove them, but I think you also need to be responsible about that too, because you want to consider the bat's safety. Joy, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, definitely. I agree. If you have a single bat in your house, you can probably get it out safely without getting bitten, but recognize that bats are very delicate. And so you need to be careful. If you're using thick leather gloves and a towel to grab the bat, maybe shoo it into a shoebox, put the lid on, take it outside, put it at the base of the tree, open it up. The bat should crawl up the tree and it will be able to fly away, just as I talked about earlier. If you have a large colony of bats in your house, then that's another story altogether. I actually just responded to an email from someone the other day who said they had bats in their attic, except they can't get into their attic. They're on the outside of a screen, but they still wanted them gone. And I said, well, why do you want them gone? Why wouldn't you want them to stay if they can't get in the house? That sounds great to me. They're doing you an ecosystem service by eating bugs in your backyard. So be careful about when you try to evict bats, but there are professionals who can do that, and you can search for those professionals on Indiana DNR's webpage. They have licensed wildlife damage control officers, is what they call them, who can come in and remove bats or beavers or raccoons or whatever is on your landscape if you want to.
This was incredibly, incredibly informative. Thank you so much, Dr. O'Keefe and Liz. I learned a lot today, and I know that our audience through their comments also did, and really enjoyed it, whether they were bat lovers or just research lovers or all of the above. So thank you guys so much for your time today, for joining us. And We do not have a Ask the Expert currently scheduled for next week, so stay tuned to our Facebook page and we will let you know when we have the next event scheduled. And Dr. O'Keefe and Liz, you guys are welcome back anytime. I know that we had a great audience today and plenty to talk about. And if you have things you want to share as Halloween approaches, we're all for it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, we will see you again soon. Have a good day.